She stood at the edge of a strange town with nothing, no money, no home, and a broken promise where her future used to be. The man she crossed the country to marry had chosen someone else. She was one cold night away from disaster. And then a cowboy with green eyes reined in his horse and asked her one quiet question that changed everything. Don't go anywhere. Welcome. This channel is home to stories straight from the heart of the Old West. Tales of cowboys who chose kindness over convenience, of women who built lives from bare dirt and sheer will, of love that grew wild and strong like the land itself, compassion, sacrifice, second chances, and the quiet courage of ordinary people. That's what we tell here. If that speaks to your soul, you're exactly where you belong. This story is proof that your lowest moment is rarely your last chapter, and that sometimes the person God sends to help you up off the ground is the very one you were always meant to walk beside. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss a story worth your time. We'll see you in the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience.
The dirt swirled around Catherine Owen's scuffed-up boots. She stood on the outskirts of Jackson, Wyoming, holding a cloth suitcase that contained every single thing she had left in the world. In her other hand, she clutched a leather pouch, holding her mother's wedding band, and the deed to a piece of land she had never laid eyes on. It was 1878, and the cold autumn wind blew her dark hair into her face. A heavy feeling like a stone settled deep in her chest. She had traveled all this way west expecting to marry a shopkeeper named Robert Calloway, but when she arrived 3 days ago, she found out he had taken a different bride just 2 weeks before and had not even bothered to tell her. So there she stood, with no place to go, not enough money to get back east, and only a faint idea that her father, before he passed, had won some land up in the Montana Territory. The sound of a horse's hooves on the hard-packed ground made Catherine turn around. A rider was coming her way. The man sat tall on his horse, his wide shoulders outlined by the setting sun that was painting the Teton Mountains in shades of gold and red. He had on a dusty brown hat, a leather vest over a blue shirt, and the sun-weathered face of a man who knew the outdoors better than any house. As he got closer, she saw he had a strong, clean-shaven jaw and eyes as green as pasture grass, and they were looking at her with real concern. He asked, his voice low and kind, "Miss, where are you headed?" His voice was deep and smooth as he pulled his reddish-brown horse to a stop a polite ways off. Catherine stood up a little straighter, trying her best not to look as hopeless as she felt. She lifted her chin and said, "North. I own some property up near Virginia City in the Montana Territory." The cowboy swung down from his saddle in one easy movement, and she saw he was a good bit taller than 6 feet. He took off his hat, showing sandy brown hair that had a little curl to it where it touched his collar. "That is a mighty long way from here," he said, choosing his words with care. "Got to be 300 miles, maybe more. You're not planning to walk there, are you?" "I will manage somehow," Catherine answered, but she could hear the doubt in her own voice. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could feel her face get warm. He was not staring in a rude way, just looking at her with a kind of quiet thoughtfulness that made her feel seen, but safe, all at the same time. "My name is Yates Young," he said, holding out his hand. "I have been working cattle down here, but I'm heading north myself. I have some business in Bozeman, which is not too far from Virginia City. You could ride along with me if you want. It would be a whole lot safer than trying to go it alone." Catherine paused for a second, hearing her mother's voice in her head, warning her about trusting strange men. Then again, her mother had never been left broke and alone in the Wyoming Territory. With winter coming on fast, she took his hand. She felt the rough calluses on his palm and was surprised by how gentle his handshake was. "Catherine Owen," she said. "I would surely appreciate the company, but I have to tell you right now, I have no way to pay you for your help." Yates just shook his head and put his hat back on. "I did not ask for any pay." But you should know it will probably take us close to 2 weeks, maybe longer. And the weather can get real nasty this time of year. We will have to keep a steady pace, but be careful." "I understand," Catherine said. A wave of relief washed over her so fast that her eyes started to burn with tears she did not expect. She blinked them away, refusing to let him see her cry. Yates kindly pretended he had not noticed. "There is a general store that is still open. We ought to get you some better clothes for traveling and some supplies. I have got enough money to see to it, and you can just pay me back once you are settled in on your land." "I cannot take your charity," Catherine protested, even though the thin cotton dress she had on was no good for a long trip through the mountains. "It is not charity, it is just common sense," Yates said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You will slow us down quite a bit if you freeze solid, and I would just as soon not have that on my conscience." Catherine could not help but smile a little at how direct he was. "Well, when you put it like that," she said, "I guess I do not have much of a choice." The two of them walked back toward town, with Yates leading his horse by the reins. He walked with a comfortable confidence that showed he was at ease with himself, and Catherine found herself sneaking looks at him as they went along. She had been promised to Robert Calloway for 6 months and had never even seen the man's face. Their whole courtship was done through letters that her aunt had set up. She had convinced herself she loved the fancy words he wrote and the life of comfort he promised in a brand new town. But now she saw she did not know him one bit. What she had felt was not love. It was just a desperate need to get away from her life in Boston. Inside the general store, Yates was as good as his word. He bought her a pair of tough canvas pants, a warm wool coat, good solid boots, and a hat with a wide brim. He also got bedrolls, dried food, and everything else they would need for the trip. The man behind the counter was a skinny fellow with suspicious eyes who looked at Catherine with clear disapproval. "Does your husband know you are running around dressed in men's clothes?" he asked while he wrapped up her things. "She is not married, and it is none of your business anyway," Yates said in a low voice. But there was something in the way he said it that made the storekeeper snap his mouth shut and finish the job a lot faster. Once they were outside, Catherine turned to Yates. "Thank you," she said softly. "I mean, for standing up for me in there, not just for all of this." He looked a little surprised, like it would never have crossed his mind to do anything different. "That man had no call to talk to you like that," he said simply. "Meet me over at the livery stable when the sun comes up. I will have a horse ready for you, and we can get on our way." That evening, Catherine went back to the boarding house, where she had spent the last 3 awful days. She put on the traveling clothes Yates had bought for her and was amazed at how easily she could move in the pants. She braided her long hair up tight and tried to get some sleep, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the green-eyed cowboy. He had shown up like an answer to a prayer, right when she needed help the most. She told herself not to be a fool for a second time, and not to think his simple kindness was anything more than what it was. The sky in the east was just starting to lighten up when Catherine got to the livery the next morning. Yates was already there, checking the saddle on a calm-looking gray horse. "This here is Daisy," he said, giving the horse a pat on the neck. "She used to belong to my sister before she got married and moved out to California. Daisy is gentle and steady on her feet. She will treat you right." Catherine walked up to the horse slowly and held out her hand for Daisy to smell. "I ought to tell you, I have only been on a horse a handful of times in my whole life. Back in Boston, we always took carriages." "Daisy will teach you better than I ever could," Yates said with a small smile. "Just sit up straight and trust her. She's been through these mountains more times than I can even remember." As the sun climbed over the peaks, they rode out of Jackson and headed north. The morning air was sharp and cold, and Catherine could see her breath in front of her, but the wool coat kept her plenty warm. Yates kept them at a comfortable pace, and he kept looking back to make sure she was doing all right. The country around them was so beautiful it almost hurt to look at. Wide open fields rolled into forests of pine trees, with mountains shooting up on both sides like the spires of a church. By the middle of the day, Catherine's legs were aching from holding onto the saddle, and her back was stiff as a board, but she did not dare complain. It seemed Yates knew how she was feeling anyway, because he soon called for them to stop and rest by a little stream. He helped her get down, and Catherine's legs felt so weak they almost gave out from under her. "It gets easier after the first couple of days," Yates said, handing her a canteen full of water. "Your body just has to get used to it." They sat down on a fallen tree, eating some dried beef and hard biscuits. Catherine watched Yates out of the corner of her eye as he looked out at the land, with a peaceful look on his face. He had a stillness about him that she found calming, especially after all the years in her aunt's busy Boston home, where there was always noise and things to do. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine finally said. Yates turned toward her and nodded. "Why are you doing this for me? You do not know me from Adam. I could be anybody." He thought about that for a minute, taking a long drink of water before he spoke. "My mama died when I was 12, he said, his voice slow. "Me, my sister, and her were traveling from Missouri out to Oregon. We were going to meet my pa, who had gone on ahead to get a homestead started. Mama got sick on the trail, and by the time we made it to Fort Bridger, she was just too weak to keep going. A man there, a trapper named Samuel, he took us in. He looked after my mama for 3 weeks, and when she passed on anyway, he let me and my sister stay with him for the whole winter. He fed us, gave us clothes, and taught me how to work with horses and leather. Come spring, he paid our way to get on a wagon train heading to Oregon." Yates stopped for a moment, and his jaw tensed up like the words were hard to find. "I asked him why he would do all that for complete strangers. He told me that kindness does not need a reason, and that this world is hard enough without us making it any harder for each other. He said if I ever wanted to pay him back, I should just do the same for somebody else when I had the chance." Catherine felt a change deep inside her chest, a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun, which was now high in the sky. "Your mother was very lucky to have a man like him there to help." "I believe she was," Yates said. "Even though I truly wish she had made it all the way to Oregon, my daddy never did get over losing Mama. He kept working that patch of land for about 5 more years, but then a busted leg got infected and he passed on. My sister got hitched and lit out for California with her new husband, and I've just been drifting ever since. I have been pushing cattle and doing ranch work, never really putting down roots anyplace." "Do you ever want to put down roots?" Catherine asked him. Yates just looked at her, and something in his eyes made her forget how to breathe for a second. "I'm starting to think I just might," he said, his voice low. They kept riding through the rest of the afternoon, making a slow climb into higher country. When evening started to set in, Yates found them a nice spot tucked away by some aspen trees where they could set up for the night. He walked Catherine through how to get the saddle off her horse and give Daisy a good rub down, and then how to hobble her so she could eat grass without wandering too far. After that, he got a fire going, like he had done it 1,000 times, and set a pot of coffee over the flames. Catherine sat on her bedroll and just watched him. Every move he made had a purpose, a kind of smooth rhythm that came from years of living this way, with no wasted steps or lost time. Once the coffee was hot, he poured her a cup. He handed it to her with a little smile that changed his whole serious face, making him look almost like a young fella. "Tomorrow is going to be tougher," he told her, getting comfortable on the other side of the fire. "We will be going uphill most of the day, but there is a way station up there where we can get a hot meal and sleep with a real roof over our heads." "I will be just fine," Catherine said, but deep down she was already thinking about how sore her muscles would be come morning. As the sky turned dark and the stars popped out by the thousands, shining brighter than anything Catherine had ever seen back in the city, they just talked. Yates asked her about what her life was like in Boston, and she was surprised to find herself telling him things she had never once written to Robert in all those months of letters. She talked about her father, a school teacher who had a deep love for books and learning. He had even taught her to read Latin and Greek, no matter how much her aunt complained that such things were no use for a girl. She told him about how her father had passed away 2 years back, about the debts he had to leave behind, and how her aunt started pushing for Catherine to marry someone, anyone, as soon as she could to lessen the family's troubles. "So that is why you said yes to marrying a man you had never met," Yates said, and she could see the understanding in his eyes. "I truly believed I did not have another choice," Catherine confessed. "My aunt made it very plain that I could not live with her forever, and Robert sounded like a good man in his letters. He wrote all about his plans to build a library in Jackson, and how he wanted to bring a bit of culture and knowledge to the frontier. I figured we might have that in common." "But it was all a lie," Yates stated, and a flash of anger crossed his face. "I reckon he was just telling a whole bunch of women whatever he thought they wanted to hear," Catherine said, the bitter taste of it still fresh. "The lady who runs the boarding house told me he was known for it. He would write to several women at the same time, then just pick the one who showed up first with the most to offer." Yates mumbled something under his breath that sounded an awful lot like a curse. "A man like that has a reckoning coming to him." "It does not make a difference now," Catherine said, even though the shame of it all still stung her heart. "I am free of him, and I have my own piece of land, thanks to my father. He won it playing cards. Can you believe that? He never wagered on anything in his whole life, except for that one night. And he won 60 acres up in Montana. His plan was to take us all there, to start fresh, but then he got sick." "So what are you going to do with the land?" Yates asked. Catherine just shook her head. "I do not have the first clue. I have never worked a farm or a ranch a day in my life. But it belongs to me, and nobody can ever take that away. That has to mean something." "It means a whole lot," Yates said with conviction. "And land up near Virginia City is good land. You will figure it out." The way he believed in her, a woman he hardly knew, stirred something deep inside Catherine. She felt her eyes welling up with tears again. She was just floored by the decency of this quiet cowboy. He had no real reason to help her, other than some old favor owed to a stranger who had helped his family years ago. The next few days became a steady rhythm of riding all day, resting, and then making camp at night. Catherine's body got used to the saddle, just as Yates said it would, and by the fourth day, she could get on and off her horse without making a face. They rode up through mountain passes where the air got sharp and thin, and down into valleys where clear, fast rivers rushed by. Yates turned out to be fine company, just as easy with a long talk as he was with a long silence. He showed her how to read the country around them, how to see the signs of animal trails and find water, and how to guess the weather by looking at the clouds and watching the critters. Catherine found herself just watching him more and more. She noticed the little lines that formed around his eyes when he smiled, the gentle way he was with the horses, and the quiet skill he showed with every problem they came across. Whenever they passed other travelers, usually rough-looking men who sized Catherine up with their eyes, Yates would just naturally shift so he was standing between her and them, without ever making a big deal of it. She started to feel a kind of safety she had never known, not even back in the so-called civilized streets of Boston. On the seventh night, they made their camp next to a lake so still it looked like a mirror for the mountains. After they ate and the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Yates took a harmonica out of his saddlebag and started to play. The tune was sweet but sad, and it seemed to drift across the water like a quiet prayer. Catherine sat there, completely captivated, watching his face in the flickering firelight as he played. His eyes were closed, and he looked so at peace. When the last note faded, she finally found her voice. "That was so beautiful. Where did you learn to play like that?" "My mother taught me," Yates said, turning the little instrument over in his hands. This was hers. She always said music was the best cure for a weary soul. "She was right about that," Catherine said in a soft voice. Yates looked up at her then, and in the firelight his eyes seemed dark and full of meaning. "Catherine, there is something I have to tell you." Her heart started to beat a little faster. "What is it?" "I did not offer to help you just because of what Samuel did for my folks," he said, taking his time with the words. "I mean, that is a big part of it. But when I saw you there, standing at the edge of town, looking so determined, but so lost at the very same time, I felt something I have not felt in a long, long time. It was like I was meant to be right there in that moment, like it was important." Catherine felt like she could not get a breath. "Yates, I do not understand." He set the harmonica down on a rock as careful as if it were made of glass. "I am making a mess of this. What I am trying to say is, these last few days with you have been the best I can remember in a long while, maybe ever. I like talking with you. I like the sound of your laugh when Daisy does something goofy. I like how you take on every hard thing without a word of complaint, even when I know you are worn out and hurting. I like you, Catherine, probably more than I ought to, seeing as how I am just supposed to be getting you to your land and then riding on." Catherine's chest felt tight, but it was not because she was scared or worried. It was hope, a feeling so new it was almost frightening. "Who says you have to ride on?" Yates raised his head, his eyes searching her face. "Are you saying you want me to stay?" "I am saying that I like you too," Catherine whispered. "Probably more than I should, especially since I just walked away from a man I was supposed to marry. But I cannot help how I feel. You are not at all what I ever expected. You are kind, and you are patient, and you are honest, and when I am with you, I feel like I can finally take a full breath for the first time in years." Yates got to his feet and walked around the fire to sit down right next to her. He did not reach for her, but just having him that close made her skin tingle. "I need you to know I am not a wealthy man," he said, his voice quiet. "I have a little money put away, enough to get a small piece of land and some cattle, maybe build a simple house, but I could never give you the kind of life that merchant promised. Not the big house or the fancy clothes or any of that." "I do not want that life," Catherine said, turning so she could look him in the eye. "I never really did. I want to be useful, to make something that is real. I want room to breathe and to think. I want to be important for who I am, not just some decoration in a fancy room." "You are important," Yates said with a sudden fire in his voice. "You are more important than you even know." Then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle, questioning kiss at first, giving her all the time in the world to pull back. But Catherine did not pull back. Instead, she leaned into it, and her hand came up to rest on his chest, where she could feel his heart hammering just as hard as her own. The kiss grew deeper then, turning into something both urgent and sweet, a promise of a future neither one of them had ever dared to wish for. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I know this is happening fast," he murmured. "I know we ought to take our time and be sensible about all this." "I was sensible one time," Catherine said. "I agreed to marry a man I had never laid eyes on, because it seemed like the practical choice. I would much rather be reckless with someone I truly care for." Yates let out a laugh, a sound filled with pure joy and relief. "Then I suppose we will be reckless together." They sat there holding each other as the fire burned down to embers, and the night air turned chilly around them. For the first time, Catherine felt like she was right where she was supposed to be. And when they finally moved apart to get into their own bedrolls for the night, the small space between them felt like a real, physical ache. The next morning came with a cold, steady rain that soaked them clean through and turned the trail into a river of mud. But they pushed on, because now they were both in a hurry to get where they were going. As they rode, Yates told her more about his plans. As they rode, he told her about the 5 long years he had spent saving every penny, all for the dream of his own cattle ranch. He talked about scouting land up in Montana, a place where a fella without a family fortune could still carve out a life. Catherine, with rain sliding off the edge of her hat, offered a thought. "What if you looked at the property next to mine? That way," she added, We could at least be neighbors." Yates let a slow smile spread across his face and repeated the word, neighbors. He reckoned that would work out just fine. "Work out real fine," Catherine echoed, a warmth creeping into her face that had nothing to do with the chilly rain. They finally made it to the way station that afternoon. It was just a simple place, offering not much more than a solid roof and a hot meal, but after that ride, it felt like the grandest hotel. The woman in charge was a tough-looking widow named Mrs. Henderson. She took one long look at Catherine's worn-out expression and immediately led her to a private room that had a real mattress and clean linens. "Your man can bunk down in the main room with the rest of the fellas," Mrs. Henderson stated, leaving no room for argument. "He is not my husband," Catherine managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Henderson just lifted an eyebrow. "Maybe not right this minute," she said. "But that man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, girl. You could do a whole lot worse." Catherine felt a protest rise, but she was just too tired and soaked to the bone, and that bed was calling her name. She swapped her wet clothes for dry ones and was asleep the second her head hit the pillow, not stirring until Mrs. Henderson came in with breakfast and warm water the next morning. When Catherine finally came out, she saw Yates waiting for her by the fireplace, looking all cleaned up and a little on edge. He got right to the point. "I have been thinking," he began. "When we get to Virginia City, I was hoping we could visit the land office. I could file a claim on a piece of land near yours, if any is open. And maybe, just maybe, if you were open to it, we could find a preacher." Catherine felt her heart jump right into her throat. "Yates, are you asking me to marry you?" He looked her straight in the eye. "I reckon I am," he answered. "I know this is all happening fast, and I know you just got out of another promise. I would surely understand if you needed more time to get to know me. But Catherine, I am 32 years old, and I have never in my life felt for anyone what I feel for you. I do not see the point in wasting time being cautious when my heart is already sure of what it wants." "And what is it you want?" Catherine asked, taking a small step toward him. "I want to build a life right alongside you, Catherine," Yates said, his voice full of simple truth. "I want to work with you, sleep next to you, and raise our children with you. I want to sit on our porch with you when we are old and gray, watching the sun go down. If you will have me, I want every bit of it." Tears were rolling down Catherine's cheeks, but her face was split by a wide smile. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. I will build that life with you. I want all of it, too." In that moment, Yates wrapped her in his arms and kissed her, right there in the middle of the common room. Mrs. Henderson and a couple of other travelers looked on, smiling and offering their good wishes. But Catherine did not mind who was watching. It felt as if she had been holding her breath for her entire life, and she could finally let it all out. They stayed at the way station for one more day just to let the worst of the storm pass. Yates got some paper from Mrs. Henderson and penned a letter to his sister out in California, telling her all about Catherine and their new plans. Catherine wrote a short letter to her aunt back in Boston, just to say she would not be coming back and that there was no need to worry. She decided against mentioning the wedding, not feeling up to explaining her choices to a woman who never really understood her anyway. The last stretch of their trip took another week, but now it felt different. They were traveling toward a future, not just running away from a past. They shared everything on that ride, their hopes and their worries, their favorite memories, and their biggest dreams. Yates explained the business of raising cattle and all the new methods he was eager to put into practice. Catherine found herself talking about the idea of opening a school one day to teach the children of all the settlers who had no other way to get an education. "You could certainly do that," Yates told her with a supportive nod. "Once we are settled in and our own place is up and running, folks out here are always in need of a good teacher." They pulled into Virginia City on a clear October afternoon. The town was a whirlwind of activity, buzzing with the wild energy of a gold rush. The muddy streets were choked with freight wagons, men on horseback, and ladies in fancy dresses trying to keep their hems clean. New buildings were being thrown up on every corner, and the air was thick with the sounds of hammers and saws at the land office. They spoke with the clerk, who laid out a spread of maps and official papers. Catherine's property was located about 15 miles south of town, nestled in a valley with plenty of water and trees. The clerk pointed out several neighboring parcels that were still up for grabs. Yates looked over them with a careful eye before settling on a quarter section that shared a property line with Catherine's land. "You will have to prove up this claim," the clerk told them. "That means building a home, farming the land, and living on it for 5 years straight." "That is exactly what I plan to do," Yates said with solid conviction. As the clerk wrote up the documents, Catherine had to steady her hands. It was all becoming real, more real than it had seemed during all those days on the trail. She owned a piece of this earth. She was going to have a home. And if everything went as planned, she was going to have a husband to share it with. That evening they located a preacher, a Methodist minister, who said he would be happy to marry them the following morning. Catherine stayed the night in a boarding house. It was the first time she had been by herself since leaving Jackson, and her mind would not let her sleep. She kept turning over the huge decision she was about to make, marrying a man she had known for less than 3 weeks. But any time a doubt tried to take root, she would remember the look in Yates's eyes. She thought about his endless patience and the deep-down kindness that seemed to be a part of his very soul. She recalled how he made her feel safe, truly seen, and more valued than she had ever felt in her life. The next morning she put on the best outfit she had, a simple blue dress that made her eyes shine. She braided her hair and pinned it neatly, looking at her own face in a little mirror and trying to see the woman staring back. She was different, somehow. She looked stronger and more complete than the nervous girl who had first rode into Jackson just a month before. The wedding was a simple affair, held right there in the church with just the minister's wife and a couple of friendly strangers for witnesses. But when Yates held Catherine's hands in his and said his vows, his voice so firm and sure, she felt his words sink deep into her, like a blessing. When her turn came, she looked into his green eyes and promised to love and honor him for all of her days. And she meant every single word with her whole heart. After it was done, Yates kissed her with a gentle sweetness that made her feel weak in the knees. The minister's wife started to cry, saying it was the most romantic wedding she had seen in a long, long time. They both signed the marriage certificate, and Catherine wrote down her new name for the very first time, Catherine Young. It just looked right, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They spent their first night as husband and wife in a hotel, a much fancier place than either of them had stayed in for years. Yates was so nervous and gentle with her, handling her as if she were made of delicate glass. Catherine was flooded with feelings and new sensations, with the pure intimacy of being completely known by another soul. When she started crying softly afterward, Yates just held her close, stroked her hair, and told her that he loved her. It hit Catherine like a bolt of lightning that no one had spoken those words to her since her own father passed away. "I love you too," she whispered into his chest. "I love you so much it almost scares me." "Do not you be scared," Yates murmured back. "I have got you, and I will always have you." The next morning they went out and bought all the supplies they would need to build a house and get a ranch going. Yates knew exactly what to get: tools and nails, panes of glass for the windows, a cast-iron stove, seeds for a garden, some chickens, a good milk cow, and enough food to see them through the winter until they were on their feet. The bill added up fast, and Catherine felt a knot of worry tighten in her stomach as she watched their shared savings disappear. "It is going to be all right," Yates promised, giving her hand a comforting squeeze. "We have enough to make a good start, and I can always hire myself out for wages if we run short. Think of this as putting a down payment on our future." They loaded everything onto a hired wagon with a team of horses and set off for their land. It was a beautiful, crisp morning with frost making the grass sparkle. The valley where their properties were located was even prettier than the maps at the land office had shown. A creek cut through Catherine's portion, with cottonwood trees lining its banks, their leaves a brilliant autumn gold. The meadow was wide and mostly flat, sheltered on three sides by hills covered in trees. Far off in the distance, the mountains stood tall against the blue sky, like silent protectors. "It is absolutely perfect," Catherine whispered, standing next to the wagon and gazing out at the land that was now hers. "It is home," Yates said, and he slipped his arm around her waist. They made a simple camp down by the creek and started on the huge job of building a house before the first snows of winter arrived. Yates turned out to be a natural with an axe and saw, and he patiently taught Catherine how to bring down trees, peel the logs, and cut the notches for the cabin walls. The work was harder than anything she had ever done, and by the end of each day they were both bone-tired. But it was a good kind of tired, filled with the satisfaction of watching their home slowly take shape. They built it right on the line between their two pieces of land, a physical symbol of how their claims and their lives were now joined as one. By November, they had the walls up and a roof on, a floor made of rough-cut planks, and a solid door that could shut out the biting wind. They filled the gaps between the logs They packed the walls with mud and moss, got the wood stove installed just right, and pieced together a bed frame. Yates filled it high with pine boughs to serve as their mattress until a proper one could be bought. The cabin was rough around the edges, but built tough, and as the first snow of the season began to fall, Catherine felt a deep sense of pride she had never known. That winter put them through trials neither of them could have ever seen coming. The snow piled up early and heavy, keeping them snowbound in that little cabin for days on end. Their food supply dwindled faster than Yates had figured, and they had to ration every last bite. The cold was a bitter enemy that meant the fire needed feeding day and night. The loneliness was a heavy blanket with their closest neighbors more than 5 miles off, and the deep snow making travel impossible. But all that hardship had a way of pulling them closer. They learned to be a team, to know what the other needed without a word, to laugh at the small troubles and find comfort just being near one another. Yates taught Catherine to play his old harmonica, and her clumsy first notes made them both laugh so hard they cried. Catherine would read aloud from the single book she owned, a book of poems from her father. Yates would lay his head in her lap and listen as she gently ran her fingers through his hair. Then, in February, when the flour sack was nearly empty and the cabin walls felt like they were shrinking in on them, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She told Yates one frigid morning, watching his face for any sign of his true feelings. He just looked at her for a long second, and then he let out a holler of pure joy that made her jump. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, covering her face in kisses while she laughed and begged him to put her down before she got dizzy. "A baby?" he kept repeating, his voice filled with wonder. "We're going to have a baby of our own." "Are you happy about it?" Catherine asked, a sudden wave of doubt washing over her. "I know we planned on getting more settled first." "I am happier than I have ever been in my whole life," Yates said, his voice firm and sure. "This is exactly what I always wanted, Catherine. A family, a real home, just you and me and our child. This is everything." Knowing a baby was growing inside her gave Catherine a newfound will to see the last stretch of winter through. When spring finally broke through, the snow melted away and painted the whole valley green. They stepped out of their cabin like two critters finally leaving their den. Yates tilled a big patch of ground for a garden, and Catherine planted the seeds, her hands feeling a special reverence in the rich soil. They used what money they had to buy lumber in town and built a real barn for the livestock, then a henhouse, and after that they started putting up fences for a pasture. In late May, Yates took a ride into Virginia City and came back with 3 expectant heifers and a young bull, the beginning of their own herd. Catherine just stood there, watching the cattle graze in the pasture, and was nearly overcome with thankfulness. A year earlier, she had been hopeless and all alone. Now she had a husband she adored, a home they had made with their own 2 hands, and a child on the way. Their daughter was born, and she, September, with a midwife from town and a neighbor lady who'd heard Catherine was expecting there to help. The labor was a long, hard fight. and for a few moments Catherine was sure she wouldn't make it. But Yates was right there the whole time, holding her hand and whispering words to keep her strong. And when the baby finally arrived, all slippery and crying, Catherine felt a love so powerful it stole her breath. They named her Rose, after Yates's mother. She had her father's green eyes and her mother's dark hair, and it seemed she got a healthy dose of both their stubborn streaks. Yates turned out to be a wonderful father. He'd walk the floor with Rose at night when she was fussy, sing to her in his off-key voice, and just stare in awe at her tiny hands and feet. The years that came after were far from easy. Ranching was a tough business full of constant problems, from sick cattle and broken fences to dry spells that scorched the grass and made the creek run thin. Catherine had 2 more children, a boy they named James after her father, and another little girl they called Sarah. The cabin started to feel cramped, so they added on rooms, building and making things better whenever they had a little extra money. But through every single struggle, Catherine and Yates's love for each other just got stronger. They were partners, working alongside each other every day in the truest sense. They had their squabbles, of course, usually when they were both bone-tired and worrying about money, but they never went to bed angry, always remembering how precious their time was. Catherine did end up starting that school, teaching the children of other homesteaders spread all across the valley. She held the classes right there in their home during the winter, and the children would show up on horseback or in wagons, hungry to learn. Yates built her a fine bookshelf and surprised her with books he ordered all the way from back east, adding to her little library anytime they could manage it. The town of Virginia City boomed, and their ranch grew right along with it. By their 10th anniversary, they were running a herd of over 100 cattle and were known as one of the most successful outfits in the whole area. They had turned their original little cabin into a real house with glass in the windows, wooden floors, and even fancy wallpaper in the parlor that Catherine had picked out of a catalog. One evening in the late fall, they sat on the porch watching the setting sun paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Catherine leaned her head on Yates's shoulder, thinking about the young woman who had stood on the edge of Jackson with nothing but 2 bags to her name. "What's on your mind?" Yates asked, pulling her a little closer. "I was just thinking how lucky I was that you came riding along that day," Catherine said quietly, "thinking about how different my life would be if you hadn't stopped for me." "I reckon I was the lucky one," Yates replied. "Finding you was like finding a spring in the middle of a desert." "You're the one who saved me, Catherine. I was just drifting before I met you. No real anchor or direction. You gave me a reason to settle down and build something." "I think we saved each other," Catherine decided. "And we built a beautiful life from scratch." From inside the house, they could hear their children laughing. Rose was telling a story to her younger brother and sister with a whole lot of drama. Daisy, Yates's old horse, grazed peacefully out in the pasture, living out her days as a treasured pet, too old for any hard work. The garden Catherine had planted that very first spring was now full-grown and bountiful, and a curl of smoke drifted up from the chimney of the house they had raised with their own hands. "Yes," Yates agreed, placing a soft kiss on the top of her head. "We sure did build something beautiful." As the sun finally dipped behind the mountains and the first stars started to pop out, Catherine felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost overwhelming. She thought about the long road that had led her to this very spot, the shame and heartbreak that had once felt like the end of the world. But it turned out to be a new beginning, the very first step toward a life that was fuller and more real than anything she could have ever dreamed up. She was Catherine Young, a wife and a mother, a rancher and a teacher, a partner to a man who loved her completely. She owned land and cattle, had children whose laughter made their house a home, and had helped create a community in this wild place. She had finally found where she belonged in this world, and it was right, where she was supposed to be all along. The years kept rolling by, and they brought their share of happiness and sorrow, just like years always do. They buried neighbors lost to accidents and sickness, survived hard financial times that made cattle prices bottom out, and fought through seasons of both drought and abundance. Rose grew into a strong-headed young woman who had her heart set on going back east for college. James, on the other hand, was happy to stay and work the ranch with the plan to take it over one day. Sarah, their youngest, surprised them all by becoming a natural with horses, able to gentle the wildest mustangs with a calm patience. Yates's hair got some gray at the temples, which then turned to silver, and Catherine started noticing fine lines forming around her own eyes and mouth. But when she saw her reflection, she saw a woman who had lived a good, full life and loved with her whole heart, and she wouldn't have traded a single one of those lines or gray hairs for all the youth in the world. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw a big party for them. They invited folks from all over their valley and what felt like half of Virginia City. The house was bursting with friends and neighbors, people they had helped, and who had helped them through the years. There was fiddle music and dancing and more food than Catherine had seen in one spot since she first came to Montana. Later that evening, after most everyone had gone home, Yates took Catherine by the hand and led her out to the porch where they had shared so many nights. The stars were shining something fierce overhead, like a handful of diamonds tossed onto black velvet. "Do you remember what you told me that first night we made camp together?" Yates asked, his hand warm around hers. Catherine let her mind drift back through all those years, smiling as she remembered the two young, unsure people they had been. "I said a lot of things that night. Which part are you thinking of?" "You said you wanted to be useful, that you wanted to build something real, and that you wanted your life to matter." "I remember," Catherine said, her voice soft. "Well, just look at what you've built," Yates said, his gesture taking in not just the house and the ranch, but the whole valley, the school, and the community they were a part of. "Look at all the lives you've touched. You matter, Catherine. You always did, but now everyone else can see it too." Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were the good kind, the kind that come when someone truly sees you for who you are. "We built it all together," she reminded him. "Everything we have, we built as partners." "The best partner a man could ever ask for," Yates said, pulling her into a hug. "I'd do it all over again in a second. Every tough day, every hard season, just to be standing right here with you." They stood there, holding each other under that enormous Montana sky, and Catherine thought about the question Yates had asked her so long ago. "Where are you headed, miss?" Back then, she thought she was just headed for a plot of land, for a future she could barely even picture. But the truth was, she had been headed straight for this man, this life, and this love that love had put down roots as deep as an old oak, growing tougher with each season that passed. She remembered standing on that dusty road just outside of town with nothing to her name. And then, that cowboy reined in his horse just to ask where she was aiming to go, and ended up giving her the whole wide world. He gave her a roof over her head, a family to call her own, and treated her like a true partner. Their love was the solid ground beneath her feet, holding her steady through every storm and drought life threw at them. Walking back to the house hand in hand, Catherine looked back one last time at the valley spread out below, glowing like a silver blanket under the moon. Tomorrow morning, she would wake up next to the man she adored, help with the chores around their ranch, and maybe spend a little time with that student who was having trouble with his numbers. She would fix a big supper for her family, and they would all sit out on the porch to watch the sun dip below the horizon. She was getting to live one more day in this fine life she had built right up from the bare dirt, and she was thankful for every single second of it. It struck her then that this was her real destination all along. She was not searching for a spot on a map, but for a person. She was not looking for a piece of land, but for a place in his heart. And she found exactly what her soul was crying out for, right when she thought all hope was lost. She was just a girl standing at the edge of nowhere with nothing, when a kind cowboy with green eyes tipped his hat and asked a simple question that changed the rest of her days.